The nurse's call came at 11:47 p.m. My daughter Sophia needed emergency surgery, and they couldn't reach her husband Kyle. I grabbed my keys and drove through the empty streets of Portland, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I arrived at Mercy Hospital, Sophia was unconscious in the ICU. The doctor said she had maybe 6 hours before the brain swelling became fatal. I asked where Kyle was. The nurse looked away and said he'd left 3 hours ago. He said he needed air. I called his phone. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. That's when I heard it in the background of his greeting. Music, laughter, the unmistakable sound of a party happening somewhere while my daughter fought for her life. I'm Vincent Carter, 58 years old, and I've spent 30 years building a construction company from nothing. I know how to be patient. I know how to plan. And I know how to destroy someone's foundation brick by brick when they cross me. But that night, standing in that cold hospital room, watching machines breathe for my baby girl, I had to choose between rage and strategy. Kyle had married Sophia 2 years ago. I never liked him. He was smooth, charming, always talking about his investment opportunities and cryptocurrency wins. Sophia loved him though. She said he made her feel alive. I stayed quiet because that's what fathers do. We swallow our doubts and hope we're wrong. The doctor handed me consent forms. He needed to operate immediately, but Kyle was listed as next of kin. I could override it as her father, but there would be legal complications if Kyle objected later. I signed everything. My daughter's life mattered more than paperwork. As they wheeled her into surgery, I sat in the waiting room and called Kyle again. This time, someone answered. Not Kyle. A woman. She giggled and said Kyle was busy. I could hear him in the background shouting something about champagne. I asked her where they were. She laughed and said it was none of my business. Then she hung up. I sat there, staring at my phone, and made a decision. I wouldn't confront him tonight. I would wait. I called my assistant Trevor. He'd been with me for 15 years and knew how to find information quietly. I told him to locate Kyle's phone and send me the address. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Kyle was at the Riverside Marina on a yacht called Easy Money. Trevor sent photos. Kyle was surrounded by people I didn't recognize, holding a bottle of expensive vodka, laughing with his arm around a blonde woman in a red dress. My daughter was in surgery, and he was celebrating something. I took screenshots of everything. I didn't drive to the marina. I didn't call him again. I went to the hospital chapel and sat in the darkness, thinking about what comes next. Sophia came out of surgery at 4:30 a.m. The doctor said it went well, but she'd be in a coma for at least 24 hours while her brain healed. I sat beside her bed and held her hand. It was cold and small, just like when she was 7 and afraid of thunderstorms. I thought about Kyle on that yacht. I thought about the woman in the red dress. I thought about how he'd left the hospital without a word to anyone. At 6:15 a.m., Kyle stumbled into the ICU. His shirt was wrinkled. He smelled like alcohol and perfume. His eyes were red, and he looked confused when he saw me sitting there. He asked what happened. I told him Sophia almost died. He said he needed to step out for some air earlier. That's all. Just air. I didn't yell. I didn't throw him out. I stood up slowly and told him to sit with his wife. He collapsed into the chair and put his head in his hands. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know it was this serious. He said a lot of things that meant nothing. I walked out of that room and went home. I showered, changed clothes, and opened my laptop. I started making a list. Kyle owned a small tech startup that Sophia had helped fund with her inheritance from her mother. He drove a BMW that was leased under Sophia's credit. He lived in a condo that my daughter had co-signed for. Everything he had was built on her foundation, and I was about to remove that foundation piece by piece. Sophia woke up on the second day. She was weak and confused, but alive. Kyle was there, holding her hand and crying. He told her how scared he'd been, how he'd prayed all night, how he couldn't imagine life without her. She believed him. I watched from the doorway and said nothing. When Kyle left to get coffee, Sophia asked me if I was okay. I told her I was just tired. She smiled and said Kyle had been amazing through all of this. She said she was lucky to have him. I kissed her forehead and told her to rest. Then I went to the parking lot and sat in my truck, staring at the photos on my phone. The yacht. The party. The woman in red. I called my lawyer, Patricia. She'd handled my business contracts for 20 years and knew how to move quietly. I told her what happened. I told her what I needed. She was silent for a long moment, then asked if I was sure. I said yes. She told me it would take time. I said I had plenty of time. Over the next week, while Sophia recovered in the hospital, I started gathering information. I hired a private investigator named Howard. He was expensive and discreet. I gave him Kyle's information and told him to find everything. Bank accounts, credit cards, business dealings, property records, social connections. Everything. Howard worked fast. Within 5 days, he gave me a folder 3 inches thick. Kyle was drowning in debt. His startup had lost investor money for 6 straight quarters. He owed $70,000 to various creditors. He'd maxed out 3 credit cards and taken cash advances on 2 more. His BMW payments were 2 months behind. The condo was underwater, worth less than what Sophia had co-signed for. And the yacht where he'd partied while Sophia was dying? He'd rented it for $5,000 he didn't have, using a credit card that was declined twice before finally going through. The woman in red was named Cassidy. She worked as a bottle service girl at an upscale club downtown. Kyle had been seeing her for 4 months. There were hotel receipts, restaurant bills, jewelry purchases, all on Sophia's credit. Sophia came home after 12 days. She was thin and tired, but the doctors said she'd make a full recovery. Kyle carried her bags and helped her into bed. He made soup and brought her medicine and acted like the devoted husband everyone thought he was. I visited every afternoon. I brought groceries and helped with chores. I listened to Kyle talk about how the experience had changed him, how he'd realized what really mattered, how he was going to be better. I nodded and smiled and said nothing. At night, I went home and made phone calls. I contacted every creditor Kyle owed. I offered to buy their debt at full value. Most of them jumped at the chance. Within 3 weeks, I owned every dollar Kyle owed to anyone. Kyle didn't know yet. He thought he had time to figure things out. He thought Sophia's recovery meant things would go back to normal. He kept taking Cassidy to expensive dinners on Sophia's credit card. Howard's surveillance photos showed them together twice a week, always when Kyle told Sophia he had business meetings. I watched my daughter get stronger each day. She talked about going back to work. She talked about maybe trying for a baby in the spring. She talked about Kyle like he was a hero who'd save her life. I bit my tongue and waited. The hardest part wasn't the anger. It was watching Sophia love someone who didn't deserve it. But I knew the truth would destroy her if it came too fast. So I built my case brick by brick. I called Kyle on a Tuesday morning. I told him I wanted to take him to lunch to thank him for taking care of Sophia. He sounded surprised but agreed immediately. We met at a steakhouse downtown. Kyle ordered the most expensive thing on the menu and a glass of wine that cost $40. He talked about his startup and how close he was to a major breakthrough. He said he just needed one more round of funding. I let him talk. When the check came, I paid it. Then I slid a folder across the table. Kyle opened it and went pale. Inside were photos from the yacht party. Photos of him with Cassidy. Receipts from hotels and restaurants. Bank statements showing the debt. Everything. He closed the folder and tried to speak, but no words came out. I told him calmly that I knew everything. I knew about the debt. I knew about Cassidy. I knew he'd been stealing from my daughter for months. Kyle's hands shook as he gripped his napkin. He started to cry. He said it wasn't what it looked like. He said Cassidy was just a friend. He said the debt was from the business, and he'd pay it back soon. I let him finish. Then I told him I'd bought all his debt. Every creditor he owed was now paid off, and he owed me, instead, $170,000. Due immediately. Kyle stared at me like I'd just sentenced him to death. He whispered that he didn't have that kind of money. I told him I knew. Then I stood up and walked out of the restaurant. Kyle called me 17 times that afternoon. I didn't answer. He showed up at my house that evening. I let him stand on the porch and ring the doorbell until he gave up. The next morning, he tried to withdraw money from the joint account he shared with Sophia. The bank froze it. I'd filed a fraud claim, citing suspicious transactions. Sophia called me, confused and scared. She said their accounts were frozen and Kyle was acting strange. I told her I'd look into it. That afternoon, I drove to their condo. Kyle answered the door, looking like he hadn't slept. I walked past him into the living room and sat down. I told him he had two choices. He could confess everything to Sophia and leave quietly, or I'd tell her myself and destroy him publicly. Kyle chose to run. He packed a bag that night and disappeared. He didn't leave a note. He didn't say goodbye. He just vanished like a coward. Sophia called me, sobbing the next morning. She said Kyle was gone and she didn't understand why. I drove over and found her sitting on the floor of their bedroom, surrounded by his empty drawers. I held her while she cried and told her I'd figure out what happened. That's when I showed her the folder. Every photo, every receipt, every lie. She sat in silence, reading through the evidence of her husband's betrayal. When she finished, she didn't cry. She just stared at the wall and asked me how long I'd known. I told her I'd known since the night of her surgery. She asked why I didn't tell her sooner. I explained that I needed to make sure she was strong enough to hear it. I needed proof that couldn't be denied. And I needed to make sure Kyle couldn't hurt her anymore. Sophia looked at me with tears streaming down her face and asked what I'd done. I told her everything. How I'd bought his debt. How I'd frozen the accounts. How I'd given him the choice to leave on his own. She asked if I knew where he went. I said no, but it didn't matter. He was gone, and he wouldn't be coming back. Sophia nodded slowly. Then she asked me to help her pack his things. We spent that afternoon boxing up Kyle's life. His clothes, his books, his stupid motivational posters about success. We piled everything in the garage. Sophia moved through it all mechanically, not speaking. When we finished, she sat on the couch and finally broke down. The divorce papers arrived 2 weeks later. Kyle had filed from somewhere in California. He wanted half of everything, including Sophia's inheritance and the condo. Patricia laughed when she read it. She said Kyle had no legal ground to stand on. The evidence of fraud and adultery would destroy any claim he tried to make. We filed a counterclaim for restitution of the money he'd stolen. Kyle never responded. The divorce was finalized in absentia 4 months later. Sophia got everything. The condo, her inheritance, even the car Kyle had abandoned at the airport. The judge also ruled that Kyle owed Sophia $230,000 in damages. He'd never pay it, but it felt good to have it in writing. Sophia started therapy and slowly rebuilt her life. She sold the condo and bought a smaller place closer to my house. 6 months after the divorce, Howard called me. He'd found Kyle. He was working as a bartender in San Diego, living in a studio apartment and barely making rent. Cassidy had left him when the money ran out. He was alone, broke, and miserable. Howard asked if I wanted him to keep monitoring. I said no. Kyle's punishment was living with himself. I told Sophia where he was. She thanked me and said she didn't care. She was moving forward. She'd started dating someone new, a teacher named Owen, who made her laugh. She looked happy again. I watched her rebuild and felt proud. Not because I destroyed Kyle, but because she'd survived him. That was the real victory. She was stronger than she'd ever been, and Kyle was just a bad memory fading in the rearview mirror. A year later, Sophia called me with news. She was engaged. Owen had proposed during a weekend trip to the coast, and she'd said yes. They wanted a small wedding, just family and close friends. No big production. Nothing like her first wedding. I told her I'd walk her down the aisle proudly. The wedding was beautiful. Sophia wore a simple white dress and smiled the entire day. Owen treated her like she was precious, which she was. During the father-daughter dance, Sophia whispered that she was sorry for not seeing who Kyle really was. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. Sometimes the worst people are the best actors. What mattered was that she'd survived and chosen better the second time. She hugged me tight and said she was lucky to have me. I told her I was the lucky one. Kyle sent a message through a mutual friend a few months later. He wanted to apologize and make amends. Sophia asked me what she should do. I told her it was entirely her choice, but reminded her that Kyle had never apologized when it mattered. He'd only shown remorse when there was nothing left to gain. Sophia thought about it for a few days, then declined. She said some doors should stay closed. I agreed. She was building a new life, and Kyle had no place in it. That was the last time his name came up. Owen and Sophia bought a house. They adopted a rescue dog named Max. They started talking about having kids. Life moved forward the way it should, built on trust and honesty instead of lies and debt. I learned something important through all of this. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be immediate. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait. Let the person show you exactly who they are. Gather your evidence. Build your case. Then act with precision, not emotion. Kyle destroyed himself. I just made sure he couldn't take my daughter down with him. The yacht party, the debts, the lies, they were all his choices. I simply made sure he faced the consequences. And Sophia? She didn't need me to rescue her. She needed me to catch her when she fell and help her stand back up. That's what fathers do. We don't fix everything. We just make sure our kids have the strength to fix themselves. 3 years after Sophia's surgery, I sold my construction company. I was 61 and tired of the long days. I wanted time to fish and travel and be present for my family. Owen and Sophia had a baby girl. They named her Isabella. She had Sophia's eyes and Owen's smile. I held her in the hospital and thought about how close I came to losing Sophia that night 3 years ago. How different everything would be if the surgery had failed. How Kyle would have probably collected life insurance and moved on like nothing happened. But none of that mattered now. Isabella was here. Sophia was happy. And I'd learned that patience isn't passive. Patience is strategic. It's powerful. It's knowing when to wait and when to strike. Kyle learned that lesson too late. I ran into Cassidy once, completely by accident. I was having coffee downtown when she walked in. She didn't recognize me at first, but I recognized her. The red dress was gone, replaced by a server's uniform. She looked tired and older than she should have. I could have said something cruel. I could have made her feel as small as she'd made Sophia feel. But I didn't. I just watched her take orders and clean tables and realized she was living her own consequences. Kyle wasn't the only one who'd lost everything. She'd thrown away whatever chance she had at a real life for a man who couldn't even support himself. That was punishment enough. I finished my coffee and left. Some people don't deserve your anger. They just deserve your indifference. Sophia's therapy helped her understand that Kyle's betrayal wasn't about her. It was about him, his weakness, his selfishness, his inability to be honest about who he was. She stopped blaming herself for missing the signs. She stopped wondering what she could have done differently. She accepted that some people hide their true nature until it's too late, and that's not the victim's fault. Owen helped too. He was everything Kyle wasn't: steady, honest, present. He showed Sophia what real love looked like. Not grand gestures and expensive gifts, but quiet support and daily kindness. That's what mattered. That's what lasted. And Isabella? She'd grow up seeing her parents treat each other with respect. She'd learn what a real partnership looked like. That was worth more than any revenge I could have planned. Looking back, I don't regret choosing patience. I don't regret building a case instead of throwing punches. I don't regret making sure Kyle's destruction was complete and legal. He'd made his choices, and I made mine. I chose to protect my daughter. I chose to be strategic. I chose to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt her. Kyle's out there somewhere, living with his decisions. Sophia's here, building a life full of love and trust. Isabella's growing up with parents who show her what strength looks like. And me? I'm a grandfather who knows that sometimes the best revenge is simply making sure the people you love are safe, happy, and free from those who'd harm them. That's patience. That's victory. That's love.